The Midtown Police Precinct's main lobby falls into stunned silence as a woman in casual mom clothes steps through the entrance, flanked by federal agents displaying Central Intelligence Agency credentials. Officer Ryan Blackwood's arrogant smirk dissolves into horror as he recognizes the black woman he'd publicly humiliated and handcuffed in front of her 8-year-old son 40 minutes earlier. "Good afternoon, officers," Agent Victoria Cross announces, her voice carrying unmistakable federal authority throughout the precinct. "I'm Agent Victoria Cross, CIA Operations Officer. Some of you may not recognize me without handcuffs, as I've been operating under deep cover for the past 6 months, conducting surveillance on a national security matter in your jurisdiction." Her eyes lock onto Blackwood, who has gone pale. "Officer Blackwood, I believe we need to discuss why you arrested me for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest while I was walking my son home from school. Told me to know my place when I asked what law I'd violated, and informed bystanders that people like me need to learn respect for authority." The gathered officers freeze in recognition. The cop, who 30 minutes ago had treated her like a criminal, now faces the federal agent whose mission he compromised, and his career is about to end on federal charges. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, CIA Operations Officer Victoria Cross had received one of the most sensitive assignments of her 12-year intelligence career. At 34, Cross had built her reputation on deep cover operations that required complete identity, immersion, from tracking arms dealers in Eastern Europe to monitoring terrorist financing networks in Southeast Asia. Her ability to disappear into assumed identities while maintaining operational effectiveness had made her invaluable for missions requiring extended field presence without detection. The Fairmont assignment was different from her typical international work, but equally critical. The CIA's Domestic Contact Division had received credible intelligence that a foreign adversary was operating a sleeper cell in the suburban community, using legitimate businesses as covers for intelligence gathering and potential sabotage operations targeting nearby defense contractors and military installations. Cross's mission was to establish deep cover as a single mother living in the Hillcrest district, close enough to monitor suspected cell members while appearing to be an ordinary resident concerned only with work and raising her son. The cover identity was meticulously constructed. Victoria Vicky Cross, a divorced marketing consultant who had relocated to Fairmont for a fresh start after her ex-husband's infidelity. Her 8-year-old son, Marcus, was actually her nephew, temporarily placed in her custody through carefully orchestrated family court proceedings that created legitimate documentation of their relationship. Marcus had been briefed age-appropriately about the importance of their special game while being protected from understanding the actual nature of his aunt's work. The operation required Cross to live authentically as a black single mother in a predominantly white suburban community, an experience that exposed her to daily microaggressions and subtle discrimination she hadn't anticipated. When accepting the assignment, store clerks followed her through aisles. Teachers questioned Marcus's academic abilities despite his advanced performance, and neighbors made assumptions about her employment and living situation that revealed their racial biases. But Cross had adapted to the social dynamics while maintaining operational focus. Her targets, an import-export business owner and his associates, had shown no awareness that they were under surveillance. The mission was proceeding exactly as planned until Officer Ryan Blackwood's misconduct threatened to compromise months of careful work. Officer Ryan Blackwood had been with the Fairmont Police Department for 8 years, the last 4 as a patrol officer in the Hillcrest district, where his aggressive enforcement style had generated numerous civilian complaints that were consistently dismissed by supervisors who praised his proactive policing and arrest Statistics Blackwood's personnel file showed a troubling pattern that internal affairs had either ignored or rationalized. 17 excessive force complaints over 6 years, with 16 involving black or Latino suspects. 42 civilian complaints about unprofessional conduct, with 38 involving minority residents. And a use of force rate 300% higher than other officers in his precinct, despite patrolling the same geographic area and demographic populations. What made Blackwood particularly dangerous was his skill at manufacturing probable cause and manipulating police reports to justify questionable arrests. He had learned to use legal terminology that survived cursory review while concealing the discriminatory motivations underlying his enforcement decisions. His reports described furtive movements, suspicious behavior, and failure to comply with lawful orders in situations where video evidence, when it existed, often contradicted his written narratives. His supervisors, including Sergeant Dan Kruger and Lieutenant Alex Turner, had created a culture of institutional protection around officers like Blackwood by treating civilian complaints as inherent adversarial rather than potentially legitimate, dismissing patterns of misconduct as coincidental, and prioritizing arrest statistics over constitutional compliance. This institutional enabling had given Blackwood confidence that his authority was absolute and his actions would face no meaningful consequences, regardless of their legality or appropriateness. Cross had been walking Marcus home from Hillcrest Elementary School, maintaining the routine of a dedicated single mother, when she'd noticed unusual activity around the import-export business that was central to her surveillance mission. Her operational training had kicked in automatically, positioning herself to observe without appearing to do so, mentally cataloging vehicle license plates and individual descriptions, and considering how to document the intelligence without compromising her cover. What she hadn't anticipated was that her momentary pause to observe her targets would attract Blackwood's attention and trigger an encounter that would threaten both her mission and her safety. The CIA's Regional Operations Center, located 30 minutes from Fairmont in an unmarked federal building, had been monitoring Cross's assignment through periodic check-ins and encrypted communications. Section Chief Laura Kim supervised Cross's operation as part of a broader counterintelligence initiative that included similar deep-cover deployments. In 4 other suburban communities nationwide, Cross's handler protocols required daily communications through a sophisticated system that appeared to be routine social media activity, but actually transmitted coded operational updates. Any disruption to these communications for more than 24 hours would trigger immediate response from backup agents and federal law enforcement. The mission parameters specifically required Cross to avoid any interaction with local law enforcement that might compromise her cover or reveal her federal status. CIA domestic operations required careful coordination with FBI and local agencies to prevent exactly the kind of exposure that Blackwood's misconduct was about to create. Director Patricia Vale, who supervised all domestic counterintelligence operations, had been briefed on the Fairmont mission's importance and had personally approved Cross's deep cover deployment. The intelligence gathered was crucial for understanding foreign adversary operations within U.S. borders, and any compromise of the operation would require starting the entire 6-month process over with new personnel and cover identities. What none of the federal supervisors had anticipated was that a local police officer's routine racial profiling and abuse of authority would threaten a critical national security operation, forcing the CIA to choose between protecting their agent's cover and allowing her to be victimized by discriminatory law enforcement. As Cross had prepared for the Fairmont assignment, adopting the clothing, speech patterns, and daily routines of a suburban single mother, she'd reflected on the irony that her most challenging operational environment might not be tracking terrorists in hostile foreign countries, but navigating American law enforcement as a black woman. In her own country, what she hadn't anticipated was that within 6 months, her cover identity would be blown not by foreign intelligence services or sophisticated surveillance, but by a racist police officer whose inability to see her as anything other than a threat would expose him to federal prosecution and her to the choice between maintaining operational security and protecting her civil rights. The officer who was about to humiliate her publicly had no idea he was targeting someone whose federal authority would soon make his career-ending mistake a matter of national security as well as civil rights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria Cross was walking with 8-year-old Marcus along Maple Street, 3 blocks from Hillcrest Elementary, when she noticed 2 unmarked vehicles parked outside Meridian Export, the business she'd been monitoring for signs of foreign intelligence activity. Her operational instincts engaged automatically as she observed license plates and occupants while maintaining the appearance of a mother. Focused on her child's chatter about his school day, Marcus was excitedly describing his science project when Cross spotted her primary surveillance target, import business owner Dmitry Volkov, exiting the building with 3 men she hadn't previously identified. Her training demanded she memorize their faces, clothing, and any identifying characteristics while appearing completely absorbed in mundane parental activities. She paused at the corner, ostensibly to tie Marcus's shoe, while actually positioning herself to photograph the group with a concealed camera built into her purse strap. The intelligence value was significant. New associates suggested the network was expanding or preparing for operational activity that could threaten national security. Officer Ryan Blackwood's patrol car approached. From behind, as Cross knelt beside Marcus, her attention split between maintaining maternal cover and conducting critical surveillance. Blackwood had been patrolling Hillcrest for 4 hours without making any arrests, a statistical deficiency his supervisors would notice and question during shift review when he saw a black woman lingering near an upscale business district. His discriminatory instincts activated immediately. In Blackwood's worldview, black residents in Hillcrest were either domestic workers traveling to employment or potential criminals looking for opportunities to victimize the affluent white families who constituted his preferred constituency. "Mom, what are you doing in this area?" Blackwood called out, exiting his patrol car with the aggressive posture that had generated dozens of civilian complaints. Cross looked up from Marcus's shoe, her cover identity requiring her to respond, as any resident would, to unexpected police contact. "We're walking home from school, officer." "Is there a problem?" The respectful response should have ended the encounter, but Blackwood interpreted Cross's calm demeanor as insufficient deference to his authority. "I asked what you're doing here." "This is a business district. Where exactly are you going?" His tone carried clear suspicion and hostility that Marcus noticed immediately. Moving closer to his mother for protection, Cross maintained her cover while recognizing the encounter's potential to escalate dangerously. "We live on Elm Street, about 6 blocks from here," Cross replied evenly. "We walk this route home from school every day." "Marcus, come on, let's keep walking." But Blackwood stepped forward, blocking their path. "Hold on, I need to see some identification. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I need to verify who you are and why you're here." The demand was legally questionable. Cross had committed no crime and exhibited no behavior that would justify a detention requiring identification. But her operational situation was complex. Producing identification would reveal her address and potentially compromise her cover if Blackwood documented the encounter in ways that attracted attention from her surveillance targets. "Officer, what suspicious activity? What law requires me to show identification while walking on a public sidewalk with my son?" Gross asked, her question reflecting legitimate knowledge of constitutional rights rather than operational training. The assertion of legal rights triggered Blackwood's hostility completely. In his experience, good black residents accepted his authority without question, while troublemakers cited constitutional protections as excuses to resist legitimate law enforcement. Ma'am, when a police officer asks for identification, you provide it. That's how this works, Blackwood stated, his hand moving to his service weapon in a gesture designed to intimidate rather than respond to any actual threat. Store clerk Ahmad Hassan, working at the corner market, had been watching the encounter through the window with growing concern. He'd witnessed Blackwood's confrontational interactions with minority residents multiple times and recognized this as following the same pattern, escalating from contact to confrontation based on the officer's assumptions rather than citizen behavior. Hassan began recording with his cell phone, understanding that documentation might be crucial if the situation deteriorated further. Cross realized her operational imperatives were in direct conflict with personal safety. Maintaining cover required her to submit to Blackwood's authority and produce identification, but doing so would create police records that could compromise months of intelligence work. Asserting her rights risked arrest that would definitely blow her cover, but capitulating to illegal demands validated Blackwood's abuse of authority. "Officer, I haven't committed any crime. My son and I are walking home from school on a public sidewalk. I don't understand what law requires me to provide identification in this situation," Cross said, her training keeping her voice steady. Despite her anger at being victimized while conducting national security work, Marcus looked up at her with 8-year-old confusion about why a police officer was being mean to his aunt, not understanding that his innocent presence was both protecting them from Blackwood's worst impulses and making the situation more psychologically traumatic. "Ma'am, you're being detained for suspicious activity pending investigation," Blackwood announced, pulling out handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The detention was legally baseless. Cross had exhibited no suspicious behavior beyond being black in an area Blackwood considered inappropriate for black residents. But his experience told him that once handcuffs were applied, most people became compliant and the legal justification could be manufactured through creative report writing. Cross faced an impossible choice: resist illegal arrest and potentially endanger Marcus while definitely compromising her mission, or submit to unlawful detention that would humiliate her publicly while still risking operational exposure. "Officer, you're arresting me for walking with my child. What specific crime do you believe I've committed?" she asked, giving Blackwood one final opportunity to recognize the illegality of his actions. His response revealed the depth of his discriminatory mindset. "I'm detaining you for failure to provide identification when requested by a police officer. Suspicious loitering in a business district and now resisting a lawful detention. People like you need to understand that when police give orders, you follow them." The phrase, "people like you," made his racial motivation explicit, confirming that Cross was being victimized not for any legitimate law enforcement purpose, but because a racist officer viewed her presence in his patrol area as inherently criminal. As Hassan continued recording and Marcus began crying at seeing his mother in handcuffs, Cross made the operational decision that protecting a child's psychological welfare outweighed maintaining mission security. The cover that had taken months to establish was about to be blown by a police officer whose racism had just interfered with a federal intelligence operation. The handcuffs clicked into place around Victoria Cross's wrists as a small crowd began gathering on Maple Street, drawn by the unusual sight of a woman being arrested while walking with a child. Marcus's tears and confused questions, "Why are they hurting you? What did we do wrong?" created a scene that Ahmad Hassan continued documenting with his cell phone from inside the corner market. "Officer, this is illegal detention," Cross stated clearly. her voice carrying enough authority that several bystanders paused to listen more carefully. "I've committed no crime. I've exhibited no suspicious behavior. You're arresting me for being black in your patrol area, and you're doing it in front of my 8-year-old son." Her direct naming of racial motivation should have given Blackwood pause, but instead it triggered his anger at what he perceived as inappropriate challenges to his authority. In his worldview, citizens, especially black citizens, were supposed to accept police actions without question, and any assertion of rights constituted disrespect that justified escalated enforcement. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct, failure to provide identification, and resisting arrest," Blackwood announced, adding charges that hadn't existed moments earlier. "Your attitude and refusal to cooperate have escalated this situation unnecessarily." The circular logic was typical of discriminatory policing. Exercising constitutional rights became attitude, and questioning illegal actions became resisting arrest. Blackwood was manufacturing probable cause in real time to justify an arrest he'd decided to make, based on racial bias rather than legitimate law. Enforcement Officer Katie Morse, Blackwood's partner, had been sitting in the patrol car during the initial contact, but now approached as the situation drew public attention. She could have intervened to de-escalate or question the legal basis for arrest, but instead she enabled Blackwood's misconduct through supportive presence and silent approval. "Ryan, what's the situation?" Morse asked, her tone suggesting she was seeking information rather than challenging the arrest decision. "Suspicious subject refusing to cooperate with identification request. Now under arrest for multiple charges," Blackwood replied, using police jargon to make discriminatory enforcement sound professional and justified. Morse nodded, as though the explanation was reasonable, her complicity protecting Blackwood from having to justify his actions to a fellow officer who might recognize their illegality. Jennifer Liu, a teacher at Hillcrest Elementary who had been leaving the school, approached the scene and recognized Marcus from her colleague's class. "Marcus, sweetie, what's happening?" She asked the crying child, then addressed the officers. "I'm a teacher at his school. This is Marcus Cross. His mother picks him up every day. She's very involved, attends conferences, volunteers for events." "What's the problem?" Her testimony should have provided context that diffused any legitimate suspicion about Cross's presence in the area. She was a known community member with established connections to local institutions. But Blackwood interpreted the intervention as external pressure that threatened his control over the situation. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. Please step back and don't interfere with our investigation," Blackwood told Liu dismissively. The teacher's attempt to provide character witness testimony was rejected because Blackwood had no interest in information that contradicted his predetermined conclusion that Cross was a criminal deserving arrest. Dr. Ruth Jackson, a community activist who had been documenting police misconduct patterns in Fairmont for 3 years, arrived as news of the arrest spread through the neighborhood social media networks that had developed in response to previous incidents. "Officer Blackwood," Dr. Jackson addressed him directly, "I've witnessed your arrests before. This woman was walking with her child. What specific criminal activity did you observe that justifies handcuffs and detention?" Her question was direct and knowledgeable, reflecting familiarity with legal standards and constitutional protections that made Blackwood uncomfortable. Citizens who understood their rights and could articulate legal challenges presented complications that routine intimidation couldn't resolve. "Ma'am, I'm conducting a lawful arrest based on observed suspicious behavior and failure to comply with identification requests. This subject's attitude and resistance to lawful orders escalated the encounter," Blackwood replied, sticking to the narrative he'd constructed despite its obvious contradictions. Dr. Jackson turned to Hassan, who was still recording from the market. "Did you see suspicious behavior? Did you see her refuse to identify herself or resist any lawful orders?" Hassan nodded toward his recording phone. I watched the whole thing. She was walking with her boy. Officer stopped her for no reason I could see. She asked what law required identification. He got angry and arrested her. Everything's on video. The existence of video evidence should have concerned Blackwood, but his experience with Fairmont PD's internal investigation process had taught him that civilian recordings were routinely dismissed as incomplete or misleading, while officer testimony was accepted as authoritative regardless of contradictory evidence. Cross, still handcuffed, made one final attempt to resolve the situation without compromising her federal mission. Officer, call your supervisor. Have them review your legal authority to detain citizens for walking on public sidewalks. This arrest is going to create problems for you and this department that could easily be avoided by recognizing your mistake and releasing me. The suggestion that his actions might create problems and the reference to recognizing mistakes infuriated Blackwood, who interpreted reasonable advice as threats and insubordination. Lady, the only problem here is your refusal to accept that police have authority to investigate suspicious activity and detain uncooperative subjects. Your threats about creating problems for me and my department show exactly the attitude that got you arrested in the first place, Blackwood responded, his anger making him escalate rather than reconsider. The crowd had grown to about 15 people, including parents picking up children from nearby schools and business owners who had stepped outside to observe the commotion. Most showed visible discomfort with seeing a mother arrested in front of her crying child for no apparent reason. Lisa Montgomery, Cross's neighbor who had been grocery shopping, approached the scene and immediately recognized both Cross and Marcus. Vicky, what's happening? Officer, this is my neighbor. She's a marketing consultant who just moved here with her son. She's quiet, professional, minds her own business. Why is she in handcuffs? The accumulating testimony from community members should have provided Blackwood with face-saving opportunities to de-escalate, but each character witness only reinforced his commitment to the arrest because backing down would require acknowledging that his initial assessment had been wrong. As Cross was loaded into the patrol car while Marcus sobbed on the sidewalk temporarily in Jennifer Liu's care until relatives could be contacted. Ahmad Hassan's video recording captured not just the illegal arrest but the broader context of community members vouching for Cross's character and questioning the officer's actions. What none of the witnesses knew was that they had just documented a federal agent being illegally arrested while conducting a classified national security mission, and that within hours the Fairmont Police Department would face scrutiny from federal agencies with authority that vastly exceeded local law enforcement jurisdiction. While Officer Blackwood transported Victoria Cross to Fairmont Police Department's booking facility, her missed check-in with CIA handlers had triggered a comprehensive federal response that would converge on the small suburban department with devastating consequences for everyone who had enabled the illegal arrest of a federal agent at the Regional Operations Center. Section Chief Laura Kim had been monitoring routine communications when Cross's scheduled contact failed to occur at the designated time. Standard protocol allowed for 30-minute delays due to operational circumstances. But when an hour passed without any communication, Kim activated emergency response procedures. Agent Cross missed her check-in, Kim reported to Deputy Director Tony Ricci via secure communication. She's never been late for scheduled contact in 6 months of operation. We need to assume compromise or emergency. Within 15 minutes, a response team was mobilizing CIA security personnel, FBI agents with jurisdiction over attacks on federal officers, and DOJ attorneys specializing in civil rights violations against government employees. The team's initial assumption was that Cross's cover had been blown by foreign intelligence operatives, requiring immediate extraction and potential retaliation against hostile actors. What they discovered through electronic surveillance and local monitoring was far different and arguably more troubling. Their deep cover agent hadn't been compromised by sophisticated foreign adversaries, but by a racist local police officer whose discrimination had accidentally exposed a classified federal. Operation Director Patricia Vale received briefing about the situation while in meetings with National Security Council staff at CIA headquarters in Langley. Cross's operation was part of a broader counterintelligence initiative that involved millions in resources and months of preparation. The compromise represented not just personal injustice to Cross, but potential national security damage if foreign adversaries learned about federal surveillance capabilities. A local police officer arrested one of our deep cover agents for walking while black? Vale asked incredulously, processing information that seemed too absurd to be accurate. He had no idea she was federal law enforcement? Correct, Director. Officer Ryan Blackwood detained Agent Cross based on what appears to be pure racial profiling. She maintained operational cover throughout the arrest, but her extended absence from communication protocols triggered our emergency response. Deputy Director Ricci explained, the situation presented unprecedented challenges. Protecting Cross required revealing her federal status, but doing so would compromise months of intelligence work and potentially alert foreign targets that they were under surveillance. Meanwhile, FBI Special Agent Carl Hughes had been reviewing the case files for Cross's targets when he received notification about her arrest. The timing was particularly concerning because surveillance had indicated that the foreign intelligence network was preparing for some type of operational activity within the next 2 weeks. If Cross's targets realize they were under federal surveillance, they'll disappear or accelerate whatever they're planning, Hughes told his team. We need to extract her from local custody without alerting the subjects to ongoing investigation. But local PD's incompetence may have already compromised the entire operation. At Fairmont Police Department, Cross was being processed through standard booking procedures while maintaining her cover identity, despite the enormous temptation to reveal her federal status and end the humiliation immediately. Her training emphasized that premature exposure could endanger ongoing operations and potentially compromise other agents working related cases. Booking Officer Rachel Webb, one of the few Fairmont PD personnel with integrity and proper training, noticed irregularities in Cross's arrest report. Officer Blackwood, your report says the subject was loitering and acting suspiciously, but the civilian witnesses I've interviewed say she was walking with her child. What specific behavior constituted loitering? Her question should have triggered supervisory review, but Sergeant Dan Kroger dismissed the inquiry without investigation. Webb, Blackwood has 8 years' experience and knows suspicious behavior when he sees it. Process the arrest and don't second-guess patrol officers' judgment. The automatic deference to Blackwood's authority, regardless of evidence contradicting his claims, demonstrated the institutional culture that enabled discriminatory policing to continue without accountability. Ahmad Hassan had uploaded his video recording to social media, where it was rapidly shared by community members outraged at witnessing a mother arrested in front of her child for no apparent reason. The video clearly showed Cross's respectful interaction with Blackwood, her legitimate questions about legal authority, and the officer's escalating hostility culminating in arrest. Dr. Ruth Jackson, the community activist, had contacted attorney Vincent Torres, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in police misconduct cases. Torres recognized the arrest as potentially explosive litigation. Clear constitutional violations captured on video, multiple witnesses contradicting police claims, and a victim with no criminal history arrested while engaged in routine parental activities. This isn't just false arrest, Torres told Dr. Jackson after reviewing Hassan's video. This is deprivation of civil rights under color of law, potentially criminal civil rights violations, and definitely grounds for substantial damages. I'll file federal complaints within 24 hours. What Torres didn't know was that his routine civil rights case was about to become a national security incident. requiring federal intervention at the highest levels. Jennifer Liu, the teacher who had witnessed the arrest, had contacted Marcus's school to arrange emergency childcare while his mother was detained. The school's records showed Victoria Cross as an involved parent with emergency contacts, employment information, and residential history that supported her cover identity perfectly. Principal Janet Stone reviewed Cross's file with confusion. "This makes no sense. Ms. Cross volunteers for school events, attends conferences, and Marcus is one of our best students. She's exactly the kind of parent we hope to have in our community. Why would she be arrested?" The question reflected what everyone who actually knew Cross's cover identity was asking. How could someone so thoroughly integrated into community life suddenly be characterized as suspicious and dangerous by police? Back at the Regional Operations Center, technical teams were analyzing electronic surveillance of the arrest area to understand exactly what had triggered Blackwood's attention. The footage showed Cross conducting routine surveillance of her targets when Blackwood's patrol car approached, suggesting the arrest was entirely coincidental rather than related to her operational activities. "This is pure bad luck compounded by police racism," one analyst concluded. Cross was doing her job professionally when a discriminatory cop decided she didn't belong in his patrol area. If she'd been white, this never would have happened. The assessment highlighted a disturbing reality. Federal agents who were racial minorities faced additional operational risks not related to foreign adversaries or sophisticated threats, but to American law enforcement officers who couldn't distinguish between citizens exercising rights and criminals deserving arrest. As multiple federal agencies mobilized to address Cross's illegal detention, Blackwood completed his shift paperwork with the casual satisfaction of someone who believed he'd successfully removed an undesirable element from his patrol area. He had no idea that within hours, his routine racial profiling would be investigated by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The small-town police officer who thought his authority was absolute was about to discover that he had arrested someone whose federal colleagues possessed investigative powers and legal authority that would end his career and potentially his freedom. Director Patricia Vale stood in the CIA's Crisis Management Center, reviewing her legal authority and strategic options for extracting Agent Cross from local custody without compromising ongoing national security operations. The situation was unprecedented. A deep-cover intelligence officer had been illegally arrested by local law enforcement, creating both personal injustice and operational security risks that required immediate federal intervention. "What's our cleanest extraction method?" Vale asked the assembled team of CIA attorneys, FBI agents, and DOJ prosecutors who had been reviewing the legal framework for intervention. Attorney Sarah Mitchell from CIA's Office of General Counsel outlined the complexities. "We have multiple federal statutes that apply: interference with federal agents, civil rights violations, and obstruction of national security operations. We can invoke federal jurisdiction immediately, but doing so publicly reveals Agent Cross's status and compromises months of counterintelligence work." The dilemma was acute. Protecting Cross required transparency that would damage national security, while maintaining operational security meant allowing a federal agent to be victimized by discriminatory policing. Vale made the strategic decision that would define the federal response. Agent Cross's civil rights and safety take priority over operational security. We extract her immediately and deal with mission compromise as a secondary concern. No federal agent should endure illegal arrest to protect an intelligence operation. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 4 hours after Cross's arrest, a convoy of federal vehicles arrived at Fairmont Police Department headquarters. The delegation included Deputy Director Ricci, FBI Special Agent Hughes, DOJ Civil Rights Division Prosecutor Marcus Powell, and a team of federal marshals with authority to assume custody of Cross immediately, Chief Robert Stone, who had been enjoying a routine afternoon reviewing department budgets, received an emergency call from his desk sergeant. "Chief, we've got federal agents here demanding immediate access to a prisoner. They're showing CIA and FBI credentials and saying this is a national security matter." Stone's confusion was understandable. Fairmont PD typically handled routine suburban law enforcement, not federal security issues. The concept that one of their arrestees might be a federal agent seemed impossible. "I'll be right down," Stone replied, assuming the federal interest was some type of mistaken identity that could be resolved through administrative cooperation. But when he entered the lobby and saw the scale of federal response, 8 agents from multiple agencies with documentation of their authority, Stone realized this was far more serious than administrative confusion. "Chief Stone," Deputy Director Ricci addressed him formally, "we're here regarding Victoria Cross, who was arrested by your officer Ryan Blackwood approximately 4 hours ago. Ms. Cross is actually Agent Victoria Cross, a CIA operations officer conducting classified counterintelligence work under federal authority. Your officer's arrest of a federal agent represents multiple federal crimes and has compromised ongoing national security operations." The revelation hit Stone like a physical blow. His small department had somehow arrested a CIA agent, creating federal incident that could destroy careers and trigger investigations that would scrutinize every aspect of Fairmont PD operations. "There must be some mistake," Stone replied weakly. "Officer Blackwood arrested a woman for disorderly conduct and failure to provide identification. Nothing in the arrest report suggests federal law enforcement involvement." FBI Agent Hughes displayed Hassan's video recording on a tablet. "Chief Stone, this footage shows your officer arresting Agent Cross for walking with her child while conducting legitimate federal surveillance operations. She was targeted purely based on racial profiling. Your officer's own words reference people like you needing to learn respect for authority. This isn't mistaken identity. This is civil rights violation against a federal agent. The video evidence made denial impossible." Stone could see that Blackwood had arrested someone for being black in his patrol area, not for any criminal activity, and that his officers had fabricated probable cause to justify discriminatory enforcement. DOJ Prosecutor Powell served formal notification. "Chief Stone, Officer Blackwood is being charged with federal civil rights violations, interference with federal agents, and obstruction of national security operations. His supervisor and any officers who enabled this arrest face potential conspiracy charges. The Department of Justice is initiating pattern or practice investigation of your entire department, based on evidence suggesting systematic civil rights violations. The expansion from individual misconduct to departmental investigation demonstrated federal commitment to comprehensive accountability rather than isolated punishment." Lieutenant Alex Turner, who supervised Blackwood's shift, attempted damage control. "Federal agents, if we'd known Ms. Cross was CIA, obviously the situation would have been handled differently. This appears to be a communication breakdown rather than intentional interference. With federal operations, his defense that they would have treated her better if they'd known she was federal law enforcement missed the constitutional point entirely and revealed exactly the discriminatory mindset that had caused the problem." Lieutenant Turner, Agent Hughes responded coldly. "Agent Cross shouldn't need to be CIA to receive constitutional policing. Your officer arrested her for exercising rights that belong to all Americans, not just federal agents. The fact that you would have treated her differently based on her employment status proves you understand the arrest was illegitimate." Meanwhile, Cross was brought from the holding cell, where she had maintained her cover identity despite 4 hours of illegal detention. Her composed demeanor as she rejoined her federal colleagues contrasted sharply with the chaos her arrest had created for Fairmont PD. "Agent Cross," Director Vale addressed her formally, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention? What's your assessment of operational compromise?" Cross's response was professional despite her obvious anger. "I'm unharmed, but my cover identity is blown. Subjects may have been alerted by police presence in surveillance area. Officer Blackwood's discrimination has potentially compromised 6 months of counterintelligence work and endangered national security." The assessment confirmed federal officials' worst fears. Local police racism had damaged legitimate national security operations, requiring them to restart intelligence gathering from the beginning with new personnel and methods. Chief Stone realized his department faced institutional destruction. "What do you need from us to resolve this situation?" Vale's response was definitive. Officer Blackwood's immediate termination, federal prosecution of all involved personnel, consent decree requiring federal oversight of your department's civil rights compliance, and full cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence operations that your officer's misconduct has endangered. As federal agents prepared to escort Cross from the building where she had been illegally detained, Blackwood was being handcuffed by FBI agents who informed him of federal charges that could result in years in federal prison. The small-town officer who had arrested someone for walking while black was about to discover that his victim's federal colleagues possessed authority that made his local police powers seem insignificant by comparison. Agent Cross, who had maintained professional composure throughout 4 hours of illegal detention, addressed Blackwood directly. "Officer Blackwood, for 6 months, I've lived in this community as Vicky Cross, a single mother working to provide for her son. I've experienced your department's policing as a black resident, not as a federal agent. What you did to me today, the assumptions, the hostility, the manufactured probable cause, you've done to other black residents who didn't have federal colleagues coming to rescue them." Her perspective reframed the incident from isolated misconduct to systematic discrimination affecting an entire community. "You saw a black woman with a child and decided I was criminal. You escalated a non-existent situation into arrest because I asked questions about your authority. You handcuffed me in front of an 8-year-old boy, traumatizing him because you couldn't imagine that black people belong in your patrol area. That's not police work. That's racism with a badge." The direct confrontation between a CIA agent and the officer who had victimized her created visible tension throughout the room. Several officers who had worked with Blackwood for years were seeing his behavior through new eyes. Federal agents don't lie about civil rights violations, and video evidence made denial impossible. Sergeant Dan Kruger, who had supervised Blackwood and dismissed multiple civilian complaints about his discriminatory practices, realized his own culpability in enabling systematic misconduct. "Agent Cross, if Officer Blackwood's policing has been problematic, I should have identified and addressed those issues. I take responsibility for any supervisory failures. His attempt at accountability was too late and too calculated." DOJ Prosecutor Marcus Powell responded, "Sergeant Kroger, you received 17 formal complaints about Officer Blackwood's treatment of minority residents over 6 years. You dismissed each one without meaningful investigation. You praised his proactive policing and high arrest rates without examining whether those statistics reflected constitutional violations. That's not supervision, that's institutional protection of discrimination." Officer Rachel Webb, the honest booking officer who had questioned Blackwood's arrest report, stood up from her seat. "Director Vale, I've worked here for 4 years, and I've seen patterns in how some officers treat different communities. I tried to raise concerns about inconsistent enforcement, but I was told that questioning colleagues' judgment was unprofessional. I should have been more persistent, but the culture here discourages accountability." Her admission took courage, and demonstrated that not all Fairmont officers shared Blackwood's discriminatory approach, but that institutional culture had silenced those who might have challenged misconduct. Dr. Ruth Jackson, the community activist who had been documenting police discrimination patterns, entered the briefing room with attorney Vincent Torres and a delegation of community members who had experienced similar treatment from Blackwood and other officers. "This isn't just about Agent Cross," Dr. Jackson addressed the assembled officers. "We've been reporting Blackwood's discriminatory policing for years. We have 43 documented cases of black residents being arrested or cited for activities that white residents perform without police contact. Today's revelation validates everything we've been saying. This department has officers who view black skin as probable cause." Her testimony expanded the accountability moment beyond one agent's experience to systematic civil rights violations affecting the entire community. Ahmad Hassan, whose video recording had documented the illegal arrest, spoke directly to Chief Stone. "Chief, I recorded everything because I've seen Officer Blackwood do this before. He finds reasons to arrest black people who would be ignored if they were white. The difference today is his victim had federal protection. What about all the victims who didn't?" The question challenged the department to confront how many lives had been damaged by discrimination that went unaddressed until it accidentally targeted someone with institutional power to demand accountability. Lieutenant Alex Turner, facing potential federal charges for supervising officers who systematically violated civil rights, made one final attempt to minimize the department's culpability. "Directors, if we had patterns of discrimination, surely federal oversight would have identified and addressed them before this incident occurred." Director Vale's response was withering. "Lieutenant Turner, federal agencies don't routinely monitor local police departments for civil rights compliance. We assume law enforcement officers understand and follow the Constitution. Your department's discrimination continued because internal accountability failed completely. Civilian complaints were dismissed systematically, and supervisors prioritized protecting officers over protecting citizens' rights." FBI agent Hughes announced immediate federal intervention. Effective immediately, the FBI is opening pattern or practice investigation of Fairmont Police Department civil rights compliance. Officer Blackwood is being charged with federal civil rights violations. Sergeant Kruger faces supervisory liability charges, and this department will operate under federal consent decree pending comprehensive reform. The swift expansion from individual accountability to institutional oversight demonstrated federal commitment to addressing systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. Chief Stone, recognizing that his department's survival required complete cooperation, addressed his personnel. "I want every officer to understand that discriminatory policing ends today. Anyone who cannot serve all residents equally and constitutionally should consider whether law enforcement is appropriate career choice. We will cooperate fully with federal investigation and implement whatever reforms are required." As federal agents prepared to escort Blackwood from the building in handcuffs, the same restraints he had applied to Cross, Marcus entered the briefing room with Jennifer Liu, the teacher who had cared for him during his mother's detention. The 8-year-old boy, still confused and traumatized by seeing his aunt arrested, ran to Cross with tears streaming down his face. "Are you okay? Why did they hurt you? I was scared they were going to take you away forever." Cross knelt to Marcus's level, her composed federal agent demeanor softening into protective aunt mode. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Sometimes people make mistakes about who belongs where and who deserves respect. But there are good people who fix those mistakes and make sure they don't happen again. That's what's happening now." Her explanation, delivered in front of 37 law enforcement personnel, captured the essential truth about systematic reform. It required both punishing misconduct and building systems that prevented its recurrence. Officer Blackwood, led away in handcuffs by FBI agents, made one final statement to news cameras that had arrived after social media attention drew media interest. "I was doing my job, protecting this community from suspicious activity. If that's now considered criminal, then law enforcement can't function effectively." His framing of racial profiling as legitimate police work revealed his complete failure to understand that constitutional rights weren't obstacles to effective policing but foundations that made law enforcement legitimate. As the media documented Blackwood's perp walk, Cross reflected on the irony that her deepest cover operation had been blown not by sophisticated foreign adversaries but by an American police officer whose racism was more threatening to her mission than enemy intelligence services. The transformation was complete. The federal agent who had been victimized by discriminatory policing now watched her attacker face the consequences of targeting someone whose colleagues possessed authority that made local police powers seem insignificant by comparison. The morning after Agent Cross's revelation, Director Vale convened a comprehensive accountability meeting in Fairmont's City Council chambers, ensuring that the response to police discrimination would be public and transparent rather than handled through closed administrative procedures that might be perceived as federal overreach. The chamber was packed with federal officials, Fairmont PD personnel, city leadership, community members, and media representatives covering what had become a national story about a CIA agent's illegal arrest by local police. Yesterday, one of our intelligence officers was illegally arrested while conducting authorized counterintelligence operations, Vale began, addressing an audience that included Mayor Elizabeth Harper and the 5-member City Council. Agent Cross's arrest wasn't just personal injustice. It compromised national security operations and revealed systematic civil rights violations that require immediate federal intervention. Mayor Harper, realizing that her city faced potential federal lawsuits, consent decrees, and reputational damage that could affect municipal bonds and business development, attempted damage control. Director Vale, the city deeply regrets this incident. We're committed to working with federal authorities to ensure nothing similar occurs again. Her political response avoided acknowledging the systematic nature of the problem, prompting DOJ prosecutor Marcus Powell to provide uncomfortable clarity. Mayor Harper, this wasn't an isolated incident. Our preliminary investigation has identified 43 cases over 6 years where Fairmont officers arrested or cited black residents for activities that white residents performed without police contact. Agent Cross's experience represents a documented pattern, not an anomaly. Chief Robert Stone, facing the possibility of federal receivership that would strip local control over police operations, announced immediate reforms. Effective today, Officer Ryan Blackwood is terminated. Sergeant Dan Kruger is demoted to patrol officer. Lieutenant Alex Turner is suspended pending investigation. We're implementing mandatory bias training, civilian oversight, and body camera requirements for all officers. The swift personnel actions demonstrated recognition that protecting discriminatory officers would trigger even harsher federal intervention. Dr. Ruth Jackson, representing affected community members, addressed the assembled officials. We appreciate these initial steps, but black residents of Fairmont have been reporting police discrimination for years while being dismissed as unreliable or motivated by anger about legitimate arrests. Today's accountability only happened because the victim was a federal agent. What systemic changes will protect residents who don't have CIA colleagues? Her question challenged authorities to implement reforms that would benefit all residents, rather than just those with institutional power to demand accountability. FBI Agent Carl Hughes outlined the federal investigation's scope. We're examining every arrest, citation, and use of force by Fairmont PD over the past 5 years, with particular attention to demographic patterns that suggest discriminatory enforcement. Additionally, we're interviewing current and former officers about department culture, training practices and supervisory oversight that enabled systematic civil rights violations. The comprehensive review demonstrated federal commitment to addressing institutional problems rather than individual misconduct alone. Agent Cross, accompanied by 8-year-old Marcus, whose trauma was part of the broader harm caused by discriminatory policing, testified about her experience. I've worked undercover in hostile foreign countries where I faced less harassment than I experienced as a black mother in suburban America. Officer Blackwood arrested me because he couldn't imagine that black people belong in his patrol area. That mindset destroys communities and endangers national security when it compromises legitimate federal operations. Her testimony connected personal victimization to broader policy implications, making clear that police discrimination wasn't just local, civil rights issue, but national security concern. Attorney Vincent Torres announced the class action lawsuit being filed on behalf of all residents who had experienced discriminatory treatment. We're seeking compensatory damages, punitive damages, and injunctive relief, requiring comprehensive police reform under federal court supervision. The goal isn't just individual compensation, but institutional transformation that prevents future violations. The civil litigation added financial pressure to moral and legal obligations for reform, ensuring that change would be sustained beyond immediate crisis response. Officer Rachel Webb, promoted to interim sergeant after Kroger's demotion, addressed her colleagues about cultural transformation. We can't continue policing based on assumptions about who belongs in our community and who deserves respectful treatment. Every resident has constitutional rights that we're sworn to protect, not violate based on racial bias. Her elevation to supervisory role demonstrated that reform involved promoting officers with integrity rather than just punishing those who had engaged in misconduct. Ahmad Hassan, whose video recording had provided crucial evidence of Blackwood's discrimination, spoke about the importance of civilian documentation. I started recording because I'd seen Officer Blackwood target black residents before, and I knew it was wrong. Every citizen has responsibility to document injustice and demand accountability. Today proves that transparency and evidence can overcome institutional protection of discrimination. His testimony emphasized community responsibility for holding law enforcement accountable through documentation and advocacy. Jennifer Liu, the teacher who had cared for Marcus during Cross's detention, addressed the trauma inflicted on children who witnessed police misconduct. Marcus is 8 years old. He watched his aunt, whom he knows as his mother, get handcuffed and arrested for walking home from school with him. That psychological damage affects not just individuals, but entire communities' relationship with law enforcement. Reform requires acknowledging and addressing these broader harms. Her perspective highlighted how police discrimination affected families and communities beyond direct victims. The accountability meeting concluded with concrete reforms, mandatory federal oversight for 2 years, quarterly civil rights audits, revised use of force policies, community policing initiatives, and establishment of civilian review board with subpoena power to investigate complaints. Deputy Director Tony Ricci announced that Cross's counterintelligence operation would be restarted with new personnel and enhanced security measures, but that months of intelligence work had been lost due to Blackwood's discrimination. Officer Blackwood's racism didn't just violate Agent Cross's civil rights, Ricci explained. It compromised ongoing efforts to protect national security by monitoring foreign adversaries operating in American communities. Discriminatory policing weakens America's defense capabilities by interfering with legitimate federal operations. As the meeting ended, community members approached Cross to thank her for exposing problems they had experienced but couldn't address alone. Her response was consistent. I had resources and authority that most victims of police discrimination don't have. The reforms we're implementing should protect everyone, not just federal agents. the acknowledgement that her privilege as a CIA officer had enabled accountability that regular residents couldn't achieve underscored both the injustice of systematic discrimination and the importance of using institutional power to protect those without it. Officer Ryan Blackwood, meanwhile, sat in federal detention awaiting trial on civil rights charges that could result in years in prison. His union had withdrawn support after reviewing video evidence and federal testimony that made defending his actions impossible without appearing to endorse racist policing. The swift abandonment by colleagues who had previously enabled his discrimination demonstrated how accountability could isolate bad actors and encourage institutional reform. Over the following 6 weeks, Vermont Police Department underwent a transformation as comprehensive as it was uncomfortable for officers accustomed to operating without meaningful oversight or accountability for discriminatory practices. The federal consent decree imposed by DOJ required not just policy changes, but cultural revolution in how officers viewed their authority and responsibilities. The Vermont Police Reform Commission, established under federal court supervision, was chaired by former federal judge Margaret Chen and included civil rights attorneys, community representatives, police accountability experts, and law enforcement professionals with records of constitutional policing. Their mandate was to rebuild department operations from the ground up, ensuring that civil rights compliance was embedded in every aspect of police work. Dr. Sharon Williams, appointed as the new Director of Community Relations and Bias Prevention, had previously led successful police reform initiatives in 3 other cities where federal intervention had been required. Her first action was comprehensive bias training for all 127 Vermont PD personnel, training that was mandatory, ongoing, and directly tied to continued employment. We're not just teaching officers to recognize unconscious bias, Dr. Williams explained during the first department-wide session. We're building systems that make discriminatory policing organizationally impossible to sustain. Every arrest, every citation, every use of force will be analyzed for racial disparities that trigger immediate investigation. The training wasn't theoretical but practical, using body camera footage from Blackwood's arrests and other documented incidents to show officers exactly how racial bias manifested in their decision-making processes. Officer Rachel Webb, now permanent sergeant and head of the Reformed Patrol Division, implemented revolutionary accountability measures. Every officer's enforcement activities were tracked demographically, with monthly reports showing arrest rates, citation rates, and use of force rates by racial category. Any officer showing disparities exceeding 20% between demographic groups faced mandatory review and retraining. The data doesn't lie, Webb explained to her officers. If you're arresting black residents at twice the rate of white residents for identical behaviors, that's evidence of bias that requires immediate correction. We're removing the subjectivity that allowed discrimination to hide behind claims of professional judgment. The statistical monitoring eliminated plausible deniability. Officers could no longer claim their differential treatment was coincidental when data showed clear patterns of racial disparity. Ahmad Hassan, whose video documentation had been crucial for exposing Blackwood's misconduct, was appointed to the new Civilian Oversight Board with authority to review all police interactions and investigate complaints. The board included rotating community representatives, ensuring that police accountability reflected the diversity of Vermont's population. For years, residents reported discrimination and were told their complaints were baseless or motivated by anger about legitimate arrests, Hassan told the board during its first meeting. Now we have independent authority to investigate subpoena records and require explanations when officers' actions show racial bias. That changes the power dynamic completely. The civilian board could access body camera footage, review arrest reports, interview officers and complainants, and recommend discipline ranging from retraining to termination for constitutional violations. Agent Victoria Cross, whose arrest had catalyzed the comprehensive reforms, worked with federal authorities to restart her counterintelligence operation using a new cover, identity, and enhanced coordination with local law enforcement to prevent future interference. The irony is that effective policing and intelligence work require the same thing: community trust. Cross explained during a joint training session with Fairmont officers. When residents view police as legitimate protectors rather than threats, they provide information and cooperation that makes both crime-fighting and national security work more effective. Discriminatory policing undermines both missions. Her perspective helped officers understand that civil rights compliance enhanced rather than hindered legitimate law enforcement. Objectives: the FBI's pattern or practice investigation identified 12 other officers whose enforcement statistics showed potential discriminatory patterns. Though none as extreme as Blackwood's, each received intensive retraining, enhanced supervision, and ongoing monitoring to ensure their practices aligned with constitutional requirements. Officer Katie Morse, who had enabled Blackwood through silent complicity, was one of those flagged for additional oversight. "I told myself I was being professional by deferring to my partner's judgment," Morse admitted during her retraining. "But professionalism requires intervening when you witness illegal arrests, not enabling them through silence. I failed in my duty to protect citizens from unconstitutional policing." Her acknowledgement of complicity helped other officers understand that passive bystander behavior carried moral and professional responsibility equivalent to active participation in misconduct. The consent decree required Fairmont PD to maintain these reforms for 5 years, with automatic extension if violations occurred. Federal monitors would conduct quarterly audits, review all use of force incidents, and assess whether demographic disparities in enforcement had been eliminated. Dr. Ruth Jackson's community organization received federal funding to provide legal assistance and civil rights education to residents, ensuring that future police interactions would involve informed citizens who understood their rights and could effectively challenge inappropriate enforcement. Knowledge is power in police interactions. Dr. Jackson explained during community education sessions. When residents know their constitutional rights, officers can't exploit ignorance to justify illegal arrests. Education and documentation create accountability that protects everyone. The Fairmont Police Academy curriculum was completely redesigned to emphasize constitutional policing, community engagement, and bias recognition. New recruits received 160 hours of civil rights training, more than 4 times the previous requirement, and ongoing education throughout their careers. Training Director Captain James Morrison, brought in from a department with exemplary civil rights record, emphasized practical application. We're teaching officers that everyone they encounter has constitutional rights that must be respected regardless of race, class, or neighborhood. Stops, searches, and arrests must be based on specific criminal behavior, not assumptions about who looks suspicious. Officer Ryan Blackwood, meanwhile, had been convicted on 8 counts of civil rights violations and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. His conviction established legal precedent that routine traffic stops and minor arrests could trigger serious federal charges when motivated by racial bias. The message to law enforcement nationwide was clear: discriminatory policing carried potentially career-ending and freedom-threatening consequences that made constitutional compliance not just morally required, but professionally essential. Investigation of Fairmont's broader law enforcement culture revealed that Blackwood's discrimination had been enabled by supervisors who prioritized arrest statistics over constitutional compliance, creating incentives for officers to manufacture probable cause rather than develop legitimate criminal cases. We rewarded quantity over quality, arrests over problem-solving, and aggression over community engagement, admitted former Chief Stone, who had resigned rather than face federal oversight of his leadership. The culture created officers like Blackwood, who viewed residents as potential arrests rather than citizens deserving constitutional protection. 6 months after Agent Victoria Cross's dramatic revelation at Fairmont Police Department, she returned to the community, this time openly, as a CIA officer rather than under deep cover, to assess whether the reforms had produced genuine cultural transformation or merely temporary compliance that would fade once federal attention diminished. The changes were immediately visible. The same streets where Officer Blackwood had arrested her for walking while black now hosted community policing officers engaging residents in conversations about neighborhood concerns. The adversarial atmosphere that had characterized police community relations had been replaced by collaborative, problem-solving initiatives. Sergeant Rachel Webb greeted Cross at the police station with genuine pride in the department's transformation. "Agent Cross, I want to show you what constitutional policing looks like when it's embedded in every aspect of operations." She displayed the demographic, enforcement data that had become publicly available in monthly reports, a transparency reform that allowed residents and oversight bodies to monitor whether officers were applying law enforcement equitably. The data showed remarkable improvement. Arrest rate disparities between racial groups had decreased from 400% to less than 15%. Within the margin that could reflect legitimate differences in criminal behavior rather than discriminatory enforcement. "Officers know their decisions are tracked and audited," Webb explained. "That accountability has eliminated the unconscious bias that led to different enforcement standards for different communities. When discrimination triggers consequences, behavior changes quickly." Ahmad Hassan, now vice chair of the Civilian Oversight Board, reported that civilian complaints had decreased by 67%, while complaint resolution had improved dramatically. People trust the oversight process now because they see investigations that actually examine evidence and hold officers accountable when violations are found. That trust has improved police community relations more than any training program could. The statistical improvements were validated by community feedback showing measurably better relationships between police and residents across all demographic categories. Dr. Ruth Jackson's legal assistance program had helped 43 residents challenge questionable arrests and citations, with successful outcomes in 38 cases. Having legal representation available changes the entire dynamic of police interactions, Jackson explained. Officers know they'll face scrutiny if their arrests are legally questionable, which encourages them to ensure they have legitimate probable cause before making enforcement decisions. The availability of legal expertise had leveled the power imbalance that had previously allowed officers like Blackwood to arrest residents without fear of effective challenge. Marcus Cross, now 9 years old, had received counseling to address the trauma of witnessing his aunt arrested, but had also gained sophisticated understanding of civil rights and police accountability through age-appropriate discussions about what had happened and why reforms were necessary. "I understand now that some police officers made mistakes about who deserves respect and fair treatment," Marcus told Cross during their reunion. "But there are good people who fix those mistakes and make rules to prevent them from happening again. That's what you and your friends did." His mature perspective reflected how the accountability process had been explained to him as justice, working correctly rather than authority failing completely. The FBI's pattern or practice investigation had been completed, with findings that systematic reforms were working. Agent Carl Hughes reported to Director Vale that Fairmont PD had achieved substantial compliance with constitutional policing standards ahead of the consent decree's timeline. "The transformation is genuine," Hughes concluded. They've moved from a department that enabled discriminatory officers to one that actively identifies and addresses bias. The cultural change appears sustainable beyond federal oversight. Officer Ryan Blackwood had served 18 months of his 3-year federal sentence and would be released under supervised probation that prohibited him from any employment involving authority over civilians. His conviction had sent a message throughout law enforcement that racial profiling carried serious personal consequences that made constitutional compliance professionally essential. His former colleagues, when asked about his case, universally distanced themselves from his practices while acknowledging that institutional culture had previously protected rather than deterred discriminatory behavior. Jennifer Liu, the teacher who had cared for Marcus during the arrest, now served on the Police Community Liaison Committee that gave educators input into how law enforcement interacted with students and families. The partnership approach has eliminated the adversarial relationship that existed before, Liu reported. Police officers are now resources for schools, rather than threats to students and parents. Attorney Vincent Torres's class action lawsuit had been settled for $2.8 million, distributed among 43 plaintiffs who had experienced discriminatory policing, with additional funds supporting community programs and ongoing oversight mechanisms. The financial settlement mattered, but the systematic reforms matter more, Torres explained. We've established legal precedent that police departments can't ignore patterns of discriminatory enforcement without facing both federal prosecution and substantial civil liability. On Cross's final evening in Fairmont, she met with community members whose advocacy had laid the groundwork for accountability when her arrest finally provided federal leverage to demand reform. You created the documentation and persistence that made accountability possible, Cross told the assembled residents. My arrest was the catalyst, but your years of reporting, organizing, and refusing to accept discrimination as normal were the foundation that enabled federal intervention to succeed. Dr. Jackson reflected on the broader implications. Agent Cross's case proved that police discrimination affects everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a CIA officer or a community resident. If officers view your skin color as probable cause, you'll face harassment and illegal arrest. That universality of threat helped build coalition for reform that crossed economic and educational lines. As Cross prepared to return to her intelligence work, she understood that Fairmont's transformation represented both an individual victory and a model for how systematic police discrimination could be identified, exposed and reformed when institutions chose accountability over self-protection. The federal intervention had been comprehensive and sustained, not just punishing individual officers, but rebuilding department culture, training, oversight, and community relationships. The reforms were legally mandated, professionally monitored, and community-supported, creating multiple layers of protection against backsliding. Most importantly, the transformation had demonstrated that discriminatory policing wasn't inevitable or immutable, but represented institutional choices that could be reversed through sustained pressure, legal accountability, and cultural change. As Cross left Fairmont, she carried with her evidence that American law enforcement could evolve beyond its discriminatory past when faced with consequences that made constitutional compliance more rewarding than racial bias. The community, where she had been arrested for walking while black, now stood as proof that police reform was possible when victims had power. Institutions faced accountability and communities demanded justice. The CIA agent who had been handcuffed for exercising constitutional rights now saw those same streets, patrolled by officers who understood that protecting all residents' civil rights was the foundation of legitimate law enforcement authority. And that transformation, however imperfect and requiring ongoing vigilance, represented the kind of progress that made America's stated ideals about equal justice under law more than just aspirational rhetoric. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.